Yeah, schools, medical. The only other thing that comes to mind that we deal with a lot is a lot of courthouses, police offices, police departments, that way, people aren't usually happy to be in those kind of places. So,
Mhm.
so
Welcome to another episode of the In the Trenches Roundtable series. And today we're going to be doing a product showcase. Folks, there's a new sheriff in town. We're talking about the Sheriff 8.0 V2 dome camera model. So, of course, we've got our awesome panel of experts today with us.
Howdy.
hello.
Hey, everybody.
Beautiful. Really excited to dive into this one. Really excited to unpack this product a little bit more in depth. So, all right, this video today is going to break down like this. We're going to first talk about what the Sheriff 8.0 V2 even is. We're going to talk about who should be interested in this type of a model of camera. We're then going to cover why you might choose this style of dome camera versus maybe a turret camera. We'll cover any considerations with domes that you should know generally. And then finally, we're going to get some of the final thoughts on the Sheriff 8.0 V2 model. So we'll start by kicking it off. James, can you give us like a 30-second rundown on what the Sheriff 8.0 V2?
Sure. The Sheriff 8.0 V2 is our 4K or 8 megapixel dome camera. It's a wide angle camera, features a microphone. It's got a lot of things in it spec wise. It's IK10 impact resistant, which we'll talk about. Very low light capable. It's kind of your workhorse sort of standard dome camera option in our lineup.
Awesome. That's great. That was a good elevator ride. Michael, can you walk us through some of the key specs on this camera?
Yeah, sure. So it's a fixed lens. James, I think you might have to correct me on this, but I think it's a 2.8 millimeter.
It is,
So,
yep.
so it should get about 112
Nice.
degree field of view. So,
Nice.
it'll cover a very wide area. NDAA compliant. Like James said, is IK10, IP67 rated. So, it can take a little bit of water. You can even submerge it for a little bit, assuming that it's, tightened down on its dome there. But yeah, it's a great little camera. It does have a couple of leads to it. So it's got an audio input and output lead, as well as the built-in camera. But it also has alarm in and out as well, just in case you have any kind of third-party alarm setup you want to connect to it.
Heck yeah. Good rundown on the stats. Matt, one of the things that
Mhm.
Michael mentioned there was IK10 rated. James also mentioned it briefly there. Would you give us a rundown on what that actually means?
Sure. So IK10 is a way of measuring how much force in terms of energy can an object absorb before it shatters. And so IK10 is the highest rating you can get, and it means 20 joules. Joules is a way of measuring energy. And so that can feel a little confusing. So let's talk about a little bit of like what is what would 20k joules of force be? It's kind of the force of a like a wooden baseball bat. Might be around there, depends on how strong you are. But it's not going to stop like a gun. It's not going to stop an explosion. Um, Now, IK10 is the highest rating, and this means that this camera exceeds that rating. It will be in fact be a little bit more than 20 joules, but I think 20 joules is a good idea of where to sort of start for this.
Awesome. That's a really good rundown on IK10 rating and what that kind of means. And we'll unpack a little bit later some of the use cases there and why those ratings even matter. So that's awesome. A question for the entire panel here. For those of us who are aware of the version 1 model that we used to carry of the Sheriff 8.0, what's different and new about the version 2 model?
Oh, I'll take that so I think the primary two additions, 2 or 3 additions, I suppose, that we've got on this one versus the V1 is the number one kind of the highlight feature is the microphone. The previous one didn't have a microphone. So the microphone's good for listening to conversation, doesn't have a speaker built into it, but you can hear something generally from about 15 feet away. Audio could be probably its own video in itself because tons of factors and stuff to consider, but we typically say within 15 feet in a quiet environment. If you have loud machinery or something like that, of course, it's going to be lower than that potentially. So, but built-in microphone, number one. I think the sensor on it's much more low light capable, so you're going to get better nighttime performance out of this one as well. And one of the other major additions is that this one does feature the enhanced analytics, so you can do line crossing and intrusion detection, where it will only detect, people or vehicles on them as well. So those are kind of the three big things I would bring up.
Awesome. That's
And then
good.
those leads as well. So the
Yeah.
audio input and output leads, as well as the alarm. And I think this one has an SD card slot as well. So just in case somebody wants like a
Actually,
local
yeah, good
backup.
point.
That's
Yeah,
a really
so,
good point.
but they're both 802.3 AF, so power off the back of a NVR or PoE switch. So
Gotcha. So there's additional leads, Michael, to touch on that quickly. That's like you can potentially hook up third-party equipment to the camera that way through those
yeah,
leads.
if you have a better microphone, it does have to be a powered mic or a powered audio to connect directly to this camera. It can feed back through the Ethernet cable, so you can have that coming in and out of the recorder itself.
Gotcha. Cool. But if you just needed audio, you could just rely on the built-in mic
Exactly. Mhm.
in most cases. Awesome. That's
Yeah.
great. Cool. So we'll jump into the next section of the video here. Who should be interested in this type of a camera? Matt, you talked a little bit about IK10 rating and what that really means. Can you unpack more on like who or what specific industries should be using these type of cameras? Why that
Yeah, I
might
mean, I
matter?
think the sort of quintessential like example of who really wants a dome is going to be like a college campus. So there's sort of two features that a dome provides. The first one is that IK10 rating. You can kind of hit it a little bit, you can throw a beer can at it, and it's not gonna shatter. There's an additional benefit as well of compared to like a bullet camera or a turret camera, where you can just sort of grab it and wrench it, and you could turn it and point it away from whatever it was looking at previously. And that sort of frequently happens on college campuses where people feel like, this should be private, or where somebody wants to commit a crime, especially sort of harassment level crimes, and doesn't want the camera to see what's happening. So you get a lot of this sort of thing on universities, college campuses, sometimes in high schools, where somebody just turns the camera away or smashes or vandalizes the camera. And a glass dome is going to really cut that down dramatically.
I've seen a lot in schools. That seems to be, anywhere like you mentioned where there's considerations of access to the camera. So that means specifically, you may, and we can talk about this when we talk about the dome versus turret camera kind of conversation we're going to have. But anywhere, if the camera's within reach, a dome is probably potentially a better pick than a turret. And so schools, that's kind of common. I'd say like medical hospitals, we see a preference towards dome cameras for that reason. I'll share like a story. One of my first kind of interactions with customers in this industry was a nursing home that actually, had turret cameras in the past, and they had issues with, the patients there getting their canes and just knocking them out of the way, and the view would change. And they ended up, they had to get domes this time to prevent that issue. And so we ended up getting them dome cameras and fix that problem with them. So yeah, anywhere like that. I'm not sure, Michael, you have any other kind of.
Yeah, schools, medical. The only other thing that comes to mind that we deal with a lot is a lot of courthouses, police offices, or police departments. That way, people aren't usually happy to be in those kind of places. So, so those I see quite often. And yeah, that about covers it.
Yeah, the last one I'll bring up is just like, and this kind of maybe even rolls into section 3 here. We're going to talk about it, but some people just love the aesthetics of a dome camera. And that comes into areas where you want to look maybe more professional. To some people, they kind of appear more professional, maybe. Everyone has their own personal preferences. Some people don't really care how their cameras look, and some people think that the turrets are great. But I've ran into customers where there's a strong preference to dome cameras simply because of the aesthetic, and the Sheriff would be, one of the best dome cameras you can pick for that scenario.
Definitely.
Dome camera is a lot of like when people think about a security camera, that's usually the shape they think of. I think the bullet camera is a little more frequent nowadays. And we generally do prefer to, talk about, turrets in a lot of cases. But I think if like you've got this such a large history of dome cameras being uh, the icon of the industry. I mean, it's our logo.
Yeah,
that's what that-
You
definitely.
know?
No, definitely. I think, Matt, you're hitting the nail on the head. The industry defined this term, right? This model of or style of housing is also how commonly people refer to just cameras that are that style, right? Like, so without a doubt, there's a lot that plays in there. But I think what James said at the end there makes a lot of sense too. You know, aesthetically, I think there's a big difference between dome and turrets, and we should just move into section 3. So we're going to jump into section 3, which is dome cameras versus turret cameras, and kind of want to open the conversation back up to the panel here. But how do dome and turret cameras compare, and why would you want to use one versus the other? Maybe we've kind of started to talk about some of this stuff, so I'll let you all pick it right back up.
Yeah, maybe we should start with like what even a turret camera is for somebody who's not aware. A turret camera has kind of the same form factor as a dome camera in terms of, they're kind of a ball and they fit on kind of a similar mounting mechanisms and stuff like that. But the difference is the turret cameras don't actually have a clear dome in front of them. And so there's advantages to that and there's disadvantages to that. I think when you're talking about the lack of IK10 and the lack of vandal resistance that you don't get with the turret camera, that's kind of a downside to them. The upside is typically turret cameras are they're a little less maintenance and they're a little less you don't have to be quite as considerate about them when you are installing them as well. A little less factors there. You don't have the IR, the infrared light for night vision going through the glass dome. It just goes straight from the dome. So there's a little less upkeep potentially with them as well, which we can talk about, but very similar models. In fact, like even on our own website, we have a section that's called dome cameras, and the turret cameras fit under there too. So even though, technically they don't have the necessarily dome part, most people do consider turret cameras to be dome cameras. It's a little confusing, but yeah, it's kind of a nutshell on it, I suppose.
Turret cameras are basically just the dome without the glass part.
Yeah.
The same way that you would adjust and move the lens around for a dome camera is exactly what you're doing with a turret camera. It just doesn't have the glass around it. Let me bring up a couple things like that I would say for advice. If you are DIYing this and you're going to put it up on your small business or your home and you're the one installing it, use a turret. It's a way better plan it's so much more forgiving. So what I mean by that is inside the glass dome, you have air. So when you open that up, you're going to have air that gets inside of there. If you're doing this on a really humid day, you're going to trap moisture inside of it. This is going to bounce. The IR is going to hit that moisture and it's going to bounce back into the camera. When you're taking that dome off, you're putting your fingerprints and you're getting your fingerprint oil, the outside of it, probably on the inside too, because you probably touched the inside of it by accident. You don't really need to, but almost everybody does. And that's going to do the same thing. The IR is going to hit that. It's going to bounce right back into the lens. And, it's going to produce this really foggy, terrible looking photo that we'll give you an image of right here. It's very easy to sort of mess this up. On the flip side, if you're working with a professional installer and you're dealing with something like a college campus, you're probably not DIYing this. There's probably somebody who's experienced that sort of professional is generally going to do a good enough job that the downsides of a dome are not going to have to be a big consideration, and the upsides of that IK10 protection and that inability to sort of have somebody change the direction of the camera are going to be felt a little bit better.
Definitely. Yeah, that's a really good synopsis. I think it would be fair to unpack a lot more of some of the things that you mentioned here in the next section and considerations. But specifically to your point, like about like installation, what Matt was referring to in terms of like why you want to consider, the humidity or potentially the environment you're installing the camera into is because you physically have to remove that dome cover from the camera housing to install the camera, right? Whereas in a turret, you wouldn't have to do that. But I think I would love to have James recap here, like the aesthetics aspect too. And Michael and Matt, you can obviously jump in, but that's really one of the biggest things we want to think about when we look at dome cameras versus turrets. And the utility of the camera, like where is it physically being mounted in terms of aesthetics as well?
Yeah, I think it does depend on the industry. Like you go to your local grocery store and you'll be able to see, you're going to see probably more dome cameras because they've sort of blend in a little bit more. They're a little bit more normal in that area. Whereas some other industries like car washes, for example, they don't want the dome cameras in there because they're more likely to have issues with somebody. You know, if you get blasted with a hose or something like that, you know, you don't want to do that to a dome camera. Whereas a turret camera can kind of handle that a little bit better. So, you know, industry wise, it's going to depend on your application. And I'm sure, you know, if you talk to us and start going over the pros and cons of each model, then we can help you more specifically as well.
Right. And I'd also, I mean, I really appreciate that highlight, James. I also want to say that there's no right or wrong answer, and
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive, right? If you choose to put a dome camera, like a traditional style bubble dome camera in your lobby or main entrance because it's accessible, but in the back warehouse you have turret cameras, you know, that's okay too, right? It can be this a la carte solution for what's best for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. So let's use this as, I guess, as a segue to transition into section 4, which section 4 is dome camera considerations. Maybe it's a good time to bring up some of the considerations that we heard a moment ago about installation and upkeep, maintenance, those type of things.
I think Matthew covered it pretty well, but just to kind of start from the beginning, because there's the actual lens and the IR LEDs. The IR LEDs, what's light up, which is the light that lights up the area at night, have to travel through that dome in order to effectively light up the area to effectively see it. And so while you're installing that, it's really important to consider you don't want to get fingerprints all over the dome, because even your oils on your fingers and all that can actually reduce the range of your IR. It can make it all foggy looking on the dome. These things tend to show up more at night than they do during the day, although you might be able to see it during the day. So you do have to be considerate, potentially even wear gloves. I know some professionals will wear gloves when they install those to prevent that. So inside and outside the dome, that's a big thing. The other factor with that too is just over time, especially if it's in dusty environments or something like that, they're going to get dust and dirt and grime on them. So you kind of have to be a little bit more considerate about how often you're going to clean those cameras, because the more dust and everything that accumulates on them, the more likely your infrared light and your lens are going to have a more difficult time seeing through that stuff. So it's almost like a windshield on your car. If you get a bunch of leaves and dirt and dust, it's going to be harder to see through than it is going to be if you have a nice clean windshield.
Another thing that I would like to say is it's really hard to mount these types of cameras on a vertical surface outdoors, because if you get rain or something happening, all that water droplets is just going to coat that dome, and then that infrared bounce back is going to happen at night just because of water.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't necessarily have to be dirt. It can just be water from rain
Snow.
that's getting on this dome. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
100% snow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's one of those things, it's better to be mounted on a horizontal surface. How do I put it?
Like using the outdoor wall mount bracket that you'll see here in a moment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, something like that, outdoors that
Mhm.
works, but you're still out in the elements, susceptible to dust, dirt, things like that.
Yeah, and I think just to clarify, like if you are mounting it like horizontally on a building, you definitely want to make sure you have like an eaves or something covering that, so that way when water is going down, it's less likely to kind of drip and slowly drip down, in case somebody's not visualizing that.
Well, I mean, one of the things we should also mention there, which is just killer for that exact problem, is frost. You start combining that sort of dripping on there and then freezing onto it.
Yep.
That can be really problematic.
I think that's why it might
being
even
able to
make
see
sense to take like a step back in a sense and look at, like, there's really two applications in terms of installations, right? Interior, exterior. We would recommend highly away from using traditional dome style, cameras like the Sheriff's on exterior applications at all possible, right? For all these reasons. And this is where that mixing and matching might make sense and things of that nature. But,
Yeah, I think
No.
my rule of thumb is you can definitely install, I would recommend a turret 9 out of 10 times outside over a dome,
Mhm.
for every reason we just discussed. But it is possible, it just requires a little bit more care in the installation, a little bit more care in the understanding of where water and everything's going to flow down to it, and a little bit more care in the upkeep. But, and that's just with the turret, you kind of don't have to worry about those ones quite as much as you do. So,
Absolutely. And these are all considerations, right? These aren't,
yeah.
things to tell you all the reasons why you shouldn't be considering the sheriff, right? These are just things to be considering when looking into the sheriff. And there's absolutely, we can think of ample amount of use cases where a sheriff makes a ton of sense for a ton of
Yeah.
different verticals and applications.
I mean, a lot
some
of
things to really
college
think about.
campuses end up installing them outdoors. They just provide a lot more care when they're installing it.
Exactly.
And so you can overcome all of these things. They're
Exactly.
just kind of a little more difficult.
Even going back a little bit further, these things are not specific to the sheriff model. These are any dome camera
right.
model that you buy. You buy any other dome camera model, whether they tell you or not, that's going to be the reality of it. You're going to end up having to follow the same procedures, same maintenance and stuff like that. I do want to make that clear too.
No, that's a good point. That's a good point. I'm thinking of like the dome camera that's mounted on the side of the drive-through when I'm driving through at Starbucks. The side of the wall. It's
Yeah.
all scratched up by the side of
Oh, the
and stuff.
cars. Yeah, cars. Yeah, I've seen. Yeah, those
You
are the
know what I
bad.
mean? That's what I'm thinking. I'm like, oh, gee, should have been a turret. Now, that's awesome. So I think that wraps up, dome camera considerations. So let's move to section 5 and do that. Section 5 is wrapping this up. And, I'll call on each participant individually here, but, starting with Matthew, any final thoughts that you have for dome cameras?
Yeah, I would just reiterate again, like if you're going to do a DIY this, it's so much easier to use a turret. That being said, if you're in sort of this environment that is highly likely like a school, or even if your place of business has a lot more vandalism, oh man, the glass dome can really save your investment. It can be really a big deal. But if you don't face that, it's kind of an easier install to go with it.
Definitely.
We got a team that'll help you figure that out.
That's right. Absolutely. Michael, perfect jumping in point. Final thoughts on dome cameras?
They have their place. They're great. I love them. Yeah, I know you're talking about them degrading a little bit over time. You see that far less than what you would expect. I'll tell you that they actually make these things to take a beating.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
No, that's good.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that. Just even going back to the Starbucks, because I've seen that too, and I always think about that. Like, should they have gone with the turret? So it's kind of like a double-edged sword there. So like a car's going to hit that, and it's going to, you've seen them where they're all scratched up, and so the difference between a turret and a dome in that exact scenario in that drive-through. Okay, somebody hits the turret, it might actually scratch you or hit at the actual lens part, which could damage it pretty heavily, and actually it also will very likely move the camera's view. So now every time some dude hits that at the Starbucks line, they're going to have to call their security guy out and reposition that camera to make sure it's actually pointed the way they want. Whereas the dome camera, when that guy hits it, it maybe scratch it up a little bit, maybe it left a mark on his car, but it's not going to have to be repositioned because the lens itself did not move. And then imagine 2 years down the road, you buy a new dome and you just slap that thing on, it's going to be like new. And so there's like everyone's saying, there's areas to use them. They're definitely very resistant to vandal, and the IK10 is really great, and the aesthetics of them, they're beautiful. I don't know, I prefer them myself, so I can see where people go with that. But yeah, that's kind of my final thing. Definitely pros and cons to each of them. If you have questions, I'm sure we can go through and talk about your scenarios.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And it's a great point about like replacing the dome down the road if you had to, and it's doing its job. Yeah.
Yep.
There you go. That's why we have these conversations, right? So that's so awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. That's going to wrap it up. I really appreciate diving into the Sheriff 8.0 V2, the new sheriff in town, or dome cameras really in general, because a lot of these things do apply to generally dome cameras. So if you do have any questions though, and you want to learn more, please do get in touch. Of course, there'll be a bunch of links in the description below to some of the resources, some of the stuff we're talking about today, but feel free to call us, reach out to the sales team, support. We'd be happy to help. Thanks again so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
See ya.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.